My awakening began with a simple question. It occurred as I watched a familiar clip of President Bush on the morning of 9/11. Bush is sitting at Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida at 9:05 a.m. when White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card whispers into the president's ear.
A second plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack.
Why didn't the Secret Service get him out of there immediately? They didn't know how many planes were hijacked yet or what their targets were.
There were actually 8 planes that were hijacked.
We had 11 reports of hijacked aircraft.
There were thousands of planes still flying. As many as a dozen planes were reported hijacked at one point. And it was no secret the president was there. The school visit had been made public on September 7th, 4 days prior to 9/11. How could anyone be so sure hijackers weren't already on the way? Yet there he lingered, even after 2 more flights were confirmed hijacked, Flight 77 and Flight 93, the Pentagon and Shanksville planes respectively. Somewhere I saw a story claiming the president's camp didn't want to scare the kids at the school, and that's why he stayed, which I found hard to believe. Well-trained professionals are going to risk the balance of power in the world to spare the feelings of a few kids who routinely practice fire drills anyway? Well, I guess the answer was yes, because Bush stayed until 9:34 a.m., a full 29 minutes after it was known we were under attack. Think about that. Of course, we all remember the second tower being hit, but I didn't put much thought into the other parts of that day. In chronological order, the official version goes like this. 4 planes were hijacked by 19 mostly Saudi Arabian terrorists who then flew or attempted to fly those planes into 4 U.S. buildings: World Trade Center 1, World Trade Center 2, the Pentagon, and the U.S. Capitol. 3 of them were successful. American Airlines Flight 11 hit the first tower, the North Tower, at 8:46 a.m. United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m. At 9:59, the South Tower collapsed after burning for less than an hour. At 10:07 a.m., United Flight 93 crashed in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Then at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed. And I barely remembered that a third building at the World Trade Center, Building 7, collapsed at 5:20 p.m. to close out the day. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, more commonly known as NIST, backed up the official government version that intense fires weakened the steel and caused all 3 buildings to fail, including Building 7, which oddly enough was not hit by an airplane, nor was it exposed to jet fuel, which is what I thought melted the towers to get that progressive collapse started.
And you had that intense heat probably weakened the structure as well.
As I looked for answers, I found Shyam Sundar of NIST stating, "The buildings were not brought down by explosives." Until then, I didn't know explosives were even in the conversation. And like hearing a child claim innocence before a question is even posed, it had my eyebrow raised.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
With that said, it was time to take a crash course in high-rise fires. It seems that high-rise fires are more common than I thought. I found hundreds of them. According to a 2011 report by the National Fire Protection Association, there are an average of 110 fires each year in buildings over 13 stories tall. According to the report, between 2005 and 2009, there were 550 high-rise fires. Of course, there are many more all throughout history, but let's talk about some of the more startling ones. Sao Paulo, Brazil, the Joelma building, 1974. Sparked by an electrical fire, the residential building burned twice as long as the Twin Towers, yet it stood. The underlying structure wasn't even weakened. In fact, it's still in use today. The MGM Grand, which is now Bally's in Las Vegas, Nevada, caught fire in 1980, killing 85 people. It's had a few facelifts and ownership changes, but the structure underneath was never compromised. It's still in use today. Los Angeles, California, 1988. What was then called the First Interstate Bank building burned for 3.5 hours. No structural failure at all. In fact, an insurance company moved in, and today it's known as the Aon Center. In 2004, the Parque Central building in Caracas, Venezuela, the country's tallest building, burned for 17 hours. The facade was repaired, and it is in use today. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, One Meridian Plaza, 1991, burned for 18 hours. It stood. Beijing, China, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel, burned for 6 hours in 2009. It stood. Chechny's tallest building burned for 7 hours in April 2013. It stood. Dubai, Moscow, Zurich, and on and on. I was starting to see a trend. Fires don't melt steel or cause buildings to collapse. The World Trade Center has itself burned many times with no structural failure or weakening. Some significant dates include February 13, 1975, when the 9th to the 14th floors burned for 3 hours. No damage or weakening of the structure was recorded.
The fire began in an electrical wiring closet on the 11th floor. Some fire department officials and building officials here say that there's no chance the World Trade Center could become a type of towering inferno.
And in 1993, it survived a bomb detonated in a highly vulnerable area with no structural damage caused by the fires that resulted from the explosion. There was, of course, damage from the bomb, which had to be repaired, but through it all, the towers have always stood. Sometimes buildings do collapse because of structural failure, but it's usually a design problem or earthquake damage or a controlled demolition. Buildings don't come down because of fire, but when they do collapse, they tend to tip over and stay connected. After reviewing hundreds of fires, I could find only 3 occurrences of fire bringing down a steel-framed high-rise in all of history, and all 3 were on 9/11.
High-rise buildings simply do not collapse due to fire.
Collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
But there's a problem. Office and open-air jet fuel fires cannot melt steel.
A lot of things in these kind of buildings have to be fire resistant by nature. It's required by code. So there really isn't a whole lot of fuel in there to begin with.
The National Institute of Standards and Technology said that the maximum air temperatures was about 1,800 degrees or 1,000 degrees colder than what's needed to melt steel.
And it takes a blast furnace with air blowing with blowers to try to get steel to melt.
So if you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it.
This would have us to believe that these was a typical office fire, scattered office fires, if you will, that brought this building down. Since the mid-60s, I've tried to follow high-rise fires, and I'm not aware of any high-rise building that have come down as a result of fires.
And seeing black smoke come out the windows, that means that the fires were oxygen starved.
Kerosene would have burned off very quickly. What wasn't destroyed in the initial fireball would have been consumed fairly rapidly and would have only really served as an ignition for the rest of the material.
None of which would have been, in my experience as a fire protection engineer, hot enough to sufficiently soften the steel or damage the steel to result in a total collapse of the building.
Well, we're told that the planes hit the buildings and there was an explosion and a fire, and about an hour and a half later, in the case of the North Tower, the buildings collapsed due to structural weakening due to the fires. Fires in high-rises have never brought down a steel frame high-rise building at all, ever.
This is why builders and architects have loved steel for 100 years. A fire typically can't compromise the steel structure. Of course, 9/11 was not a typical day with typical fires. Jet fuel was involved. But the kerosene or the jet fuel just can't explain it. In fact, the World Trade Center fires were starved of oxygen and therefore heat. You can see it in the black smoke coming from the towers. Yet molten iron was found in the rubble of all 3 buildings. Something else had to provide the heat and energy needed to liquefy, melt, or even microscopically bend the steel in any of those 3 buildings. And unless you work for NIST, scientists agree that neither jet fuel, nor the furnishings inside those buildings could have heated the steel enough to melt it.
It just didn't add up, the way the whole thing sort of pile drove itself into the ground and all at near free fall speed.
Collapses straight down into its own footprint at free fall speed. This is uncanny. There's 40,000 tons of structural steel designed to resist this collapse.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
The animation sequence from the National Institute of Standards and Technology for their model, their mathematical model of the collapse of building number 7. And they have the inside members, that one column gave way, which they claim resulted in the collapse of all the surrounding members, and then this precipitated a global collapse. This would just not be physically possible for a gravitational collapse.
According to NIST, the failure occurred at column 79 on level 12. This means basically they're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building. That just does not make any sense. Regardless of the engineering, the logic tells you that if you have a single failure at some random point in the building, that the entire building is not going to collapse. Buildings don't break that way.
The story that just a few columns can cause a synchronized global collapse, an implosion, is, well, that's just nonsense.
The exterior columns on the outside as well as on the inside at the bottom would have to be severed almost at the same time.
The building would want to topple over. It would want to bend over that weakened area and topple over sideways. What we saw the structures came straight down upon itself.
It cannot happen that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse.
At free fall speed, that's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction.
Buildings just don't behave like that. If floors fall, they tend to fall and are braced by the floor directly beneath it, and there's some delay there. And then the next floor falls with 2 floors, and there's some more delay.
The buildings actually accelerated as they came down, meaning they were not getting resistance from these massive columns in the center of the core of this building. And when it's all finished, the outside walls from the lower floors are piled one on top of the other right in the middle of the building.
So it's fiction to say that a building as modern as World Trade Center 7 comes down with no resistance.
Doesn't add up.
The official explanation was dead wrong.
It's just not possible.
It just doesn't make sense. It's not how it works.
It can't happen.
It just can't happen.
And that cannot happen.
Couldn't happen.
There's definitely much more going on than just fire.
This was a controlled event.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
In short, the evidence is clear. We are witnessing not the collapse of a building, but its demolition.
And what we find down there is pools of molten iron.
What does that mean?
Several tons. Exactly. What is that doing there? The first responders see it. The structural engineers see it. It's documented by FEMA, the melting of steel. Normal office fires is what's supposed to have brought these buildings down, along with jet plane impacts. But jet fuel and office fires don't produce molten iron or molten steel. It doesn't begin to melt until 3,000 degrees.
At one point, I think there were about 2,800 degrees.
See the stuff he's pulling out?
Yeah.
It's red hot.
8 weeks later, we still got fires burning.
The concept of molten iron is very important here. In order to get molten iron, you have to reach unbelievable heat levels. It takes much, much more energy than you could find with any combination of burning office furniture, jet fuel, or gravity. Molten iron can be an indication of the use of thermite. Thermite, thermate, and nanothermite are super hot burning substances used by the military that can cut through steel. It can supply its own oxygen so it can burn underwater. It would explain how fires burned at ground zero for 3 months even after the area was flooded.
So thermite would also explain potentially the fact that the fires could not be put out at ground zero. The fires lasted for quite a while.
The fires were finally put out on December 13, 2001, just over 3 months after 9/11, making it the longest burning building fire in recorded history. They burned underwater for much of that time. These fires were a big question mark.
So their preferred method of dealing with this problem was to ignore or even deny the reports. John Gross, one of the chief authors of the NIST report, was captured on film while he was making a public presentation, saying that he knew of absolutely no eyewitness who has said there was a pool of molten steel.
I'm curious about
the pool of molten steel that was found in the bottom of the towers?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so.
Get down below and you see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Like lava from a volcano.
The fires got very intense down there and it actually melted beam where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall from Building 6.
The premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who produced it. I was on the site, I was on the steel yards, so I don't know that that's so.
Then I was at the site 2 weeks after it happened with Governor Pataki, right? And they had to cease digging that day. You know why? They were finding pockets of molten liquid metal.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel. And yet we have evidence of molten iron in the microspheres, in the rubble pile, and the metal pouring out of the side of the tower.
What was going on here? These guys at NIST are the official version. Office and jet fuel fires can reach about 1600 degrees under ideal conditions, but NIST said that the fires burned at 1800 degrees, which they claim was just enough to weaken and bend the steel, which led to complete failure of each building's infrastructure. But that still leaves us more than 1,000 degrees short of molten metal, which was found all over Ground Zero. They denied that molten metal existed, and they denied that witnesses heard secondary explosions going off. Even the NIST computer animation of Building 7's collapse is inaccurate, showing the outer structural walls crumpling in instead of coming straight down.
The NIST report, on which popular mechanics and much of the press has relied, is not a scientific report. It is a political document.
We need to have an investigation of NIST themselves. I believe that the reports that came out are not true.
So the fact that NIST says that is absolutely, in my opinion, it's criminal.
When I see John Gross fidget and blush as he states there was no molten metal, I see a man that is doing what many of us do when we don't tell the truth. It's basic human nature.
The only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
The collapse of the building was caused by controlled demolition.
In fact, the evidence shows very strongly that there were explosives used in the way the buildings came down.
We started running floor by floor instead of popping out. It was if they had detonated. Yeah, detonated. Plans to take down a building. Boom, 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 all the way down.
Let's discuss these pre-collapse pops. From a distance, they sound like pops, but they're actually pretty powerful. Hundreds of secondary explosions were reported at various times prior to the collapse of all 3 buildings. In a controlled demolition, these bangs are shaped charge explosives blowing out beams before a collapse. They can be programmed to go off hours or seconds before an implosion. These were mostly reported as secondary explosions by the first responders and reporters.
We've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impact.
Then somebody said that they saw an airliner go into one of those towers. Then, I don't know, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that. Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something? You got to get back something. You know that. You got to get back. All right?
The final booms and crackle are like the grand finale of a fireworks show. In a controlled demolition, the vast majority of the explosives are set to go off in an ordered fashion over the span of a few seconds as the building collapses. Depending on distance, this can sound like a rumble, booms, or crackling.
That feeling that there was something else, that there may have been something else that brought those buildings down.
There was a lot of talk there in New York of another explosion prior to the collapse of the first building.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
In this footage, which has been slowed, you can see white smoke emanating from the ground floor before the collapse wave arrives. It's an unsteady camera, but keep in mind whoever recorded this was running for their life. It was like watching a stunt car explode before it crashes at the bottom of the cliff. In this image, recently released by a Freedom of Information Act request, police department photographer captured an explosion originating at the base of the South Tower, just before the first tower collapsed. The explosions and shockwave before Building 7's collapse were captured in different ways.
We heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shockwave ripping through the building and the windows all busted out.
Squibs. In demolition vernacular, squibs refer to visible blasts from explosive charges. Often they are visible through mistiming or malfunction in some way. Usually they are hidden in the debris cloud. In simple terms, squibs are visual evidence of explosives. Squibs were recorded from the moment of the first plane impact through the collapse of the last tower. For me, they went unnoticed until I looked at the video more closely. These stills captured squibs as the towers collapsed. The official version stated these squibs were compressed air caused by the pancaking floors, which squeezed air to the point of bursting out a window. The seal of the building was already broken when the collapse began. Logically, if it was compressed air, it should have found the path of least resistance through the broken part of the building. It shouldn't have knocked out a window here or a window there, as many as 40 floors below the blast wave.
Naysayers tend to say, well, that's just air being blown out the windows. I mean, it doesn't really work to say it's just air pressure. And I estimated these are coming out faster than 100 miles an hour.
The following clips show multiple squibs popping out, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes dozens of floors away from each other. Of all the 9/11 information I've come across, this may have been the easiest to spot. Yet it provided me with one of those stark moments in which the reality of 9/11 sunk in to a new level. In this clip, notice how the squib occurs before the floors above reach the blast ejection point. Not all squibs, however, were easy to spot. Well, this is the first plane impact. Notice the dark brown smoke coming out of the top floor of the tower. This smoke is already dissipating before the plane strikes the building. In this segment, the NBC camera is pointed at the North Tower. The first tower hit. In a few seconds, the second tower is going to be hit. You'll know it when it happens because of the fireball in the lower left corner of the screen. Now keep your eye on the east facade, the one on the left. Notice how several tiny explosions go off as the second plane hits the other building. The seventh characteristic of a planned implosion is what's called a demolition wave. It's the path of destruction in a controlled demolition. It is a visible wave of explosions moving down the columns of a building just ahead of or at the speed of gravity. This array of synchronized explosives is timed to blow out floors beneath the collapse wave as the floors above reach the floors below, thus allowing a drop at approaching freefall speed. Again, let's slow down the film for some of these. When slowed down, you can see how the explosions are timed to go off, floor by floor. In this clip, you can clearly see a demolition wave proceeding down a column mostly hidden by the umbrella of the falling debris pile. Look to the right of the black line. It's a bit grainy because of the zoom. Here it is again without the black line. You can see synced explosives cutting a path down the building. The demolition wave can be hard to see with an untrained eye because it happens so fast. Often buildings being demolished will have a mesh around them to keep projectiles from shooting away. In the case of the Twin Towers, there were thousands of pieces of steel jettisoned out much further than they could have if it were a gravitational collapse. Some pieces were ejected laterally over 600 feet. Some of these pieces weighed several tons. Let's listen to what a few experts had to say on the topic.
Window mullions and things went up and out. That kind of stuff can't happen with just pure air pressure of floors getting sandwiched together.
Large multi-ton beams were hurled hundreds of yards laterally. Gravity works vertically, not laterally.
The fragments which are being, which is coming out of the tower, obviously being kicked out by an explosive action.
And here it is trailing white smoke the whole time. It really is indicative of some kind of explosion.
Anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
The columns could have been set up with explosive devices during the off-hour operations of the building by elevator company personnel.
It wouldn't be a problem once you gained access to the elevator shafts.
How about an elevator modernization, which we know was going on the 9 months prior to 9/11? There are people who noted that the elevators were locked in turn and that there were guards placed at these locked elevators during the modernization.
And in the case of a steel frame building, that means we load them with RDX cutting charges, which are loaded with individual delays, sometimes as many as 2 to 3 different delays on a given floor.
I was sick to death of the dust which was appearing on the windowsills. It was dirty grey and very, very noticeable in that week leading up to 9/11.
There were workers throughout the World Trade Center that had access to the hoistway, which is immediately adjacent to the core columns and beams in the building.
The fact that there were visitors, like engineers of some kind, wandering around the floors, carrying toolboxes and cables and so on.
We're talking about several tons of nanothermite and ordinary thermite. One would have to have access through security.
Video cameras caught trucks arriving at the World Trade Center from about August 23rd until every night until about September 2nd, September 3rd.
And between the hours of 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock, these trucks had never been in this building before. It was an anomaly. Definitely, it wasn't like it was going on for months and months and it just continued. They showed up for 10 days, 10 or 11 days approximately, then they were never seen again. And that's when they believe they wired the building.
Something was brought into that building that would help with the detonation. There may have been work done on the detonation before. It may have been going on for months, but whatever they needed at the very end, they came and brought in that 10-day period.
As I continued finding evidence leading me away from the official version, it was not surprising the main body of evidence was being removed within hours of the attacks, cleaning up a crime scene with no real investigation.
Because what they did immediately after 9/11 was they started removing the steel, the debris from Tower 7 and all the towers immediately.
400 truckloads per day of material were taken away from the World Trade Center site and sent to China for recycling.
There were laws violated in the destruction of that evidence.
I was starting to believe that things like the immediate cleanup were probably no accident. And to discover what was really happening, I'd need to find the ones behind the cleanup and the coordinated media and NIST and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which in another huge coincidence arrived at New York for a training exercise on Monday, September 10th, the night before 9/11, which is convenient as they oversaw the cleanup of Ground Zero.
To be honest with you, we arrived on late Monday night and went into action on Tuesday morning. And not until today did we get a full opportunity to work.
Unlike the attack on the World Trade Center, the attack on the Pentagon was not broadcast on live television. In fact, within the first hours of the attack, the FBI had confiscated video footage from dozens of locations, the vast majority of which has never been released. All of the images that the public does have were taken in the aftermath of the event. These available images left many puzzled as to how the damage could have been caused by the impact of a Boeing 757.
Outside the Pentagon, CNN's military affairs correspondent Jamie McIntyre. And Jamie, you got very close to where that plane went down.
That's right, Judy. A while ago, I walked right up to next to the building. Firefighters were still trying to put out the blaze. The fire, by the way, is still burning in some parts of the Pentagon. And I took a look at the huge gaping hole that's in the side of the Pentagon front. From my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. The only site is the actual side of the building that's crashed in. And as I said, the only pieces left that you can see are small enough that you could pick up in your hand. There are no large tail sections, wing sections, a fuselage, nothing like that anywhere around, which would indicate...
There was a distinct lack of visible airplane debris on the lawn in front of the building, and very little reported inside. Although a relatively few amount of scraps and plane parts were photographed, none have been positively identified as belonging to Flight 77 or tail number N644AA, and there were no photographs of large fuselage sections, wings, or recognizable pieces of the tail, as is usually the case after a plane crash. Additionally, although this image of the damage after the roof collapsed is typically what is used by the media, the pre-collapse damage of the building seemed incompatible with the dimensions of a 757. Windows were still intact where the vertical stabilizer would have hit. Although these windows were considered blast-proof, it's not reasonable to suggest that they would be 757-proof. Oddly, just beneath these windows, right in the center of the hole, column 14AA on the second floor remained intact. The columns in the area where the right wing and engine would have entered appeared to have been blown up and out, as opposed to having been pushed in, as would be expected if a plane had impacted. The damage is primarily at ground level, indicating that the massive Boeing would had to have slid on its belly into the bottom floor of the building, with the huge RB-211 engines digging into the concrete. And yet there is a conspicuous lack of damage to the foundation in all of the aftermath photos. The following plane crash examples show how damage and charring is to be expected. Yet none of these images from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, taken by photographer Jocelyn Augustino on September 21, 2001, a mere 10 days after the event, show any signs of damage to the foundation at all. The lack of visible foundation damage is underscored by an important scientifically validated fact that also fatally contradicts what we have been told. Using the reported speed and other values from the 2006 released NTSB alleged black box data, Pilots for 9/11 Truth has calculated the G-forces required for a 757 to descend to the level of the light poles and pull up to enter the building low and level as required by the physical damage, and found it to be aeronautically impossible. This is the case if we simply consider the obstacles and decline in topography in relation to the official flight path, but it gets much worse if we factor in the NTSB reported altitude of 699 feet above sea level. So the physics of flight mathematically prove the official story impossible. These dubious facts concerning the physical evidence and the physics of the event, added with a deliberate lack of transparency by the authorities when it came to the evidence in general, led many to doubt the official account of what transpired that day. Numerous alternative theories were put forth, but they were mostly speculative.
There were 45 people on board the hijacked United Airlines 757 when it nosedived into the ground at the edge of this old strip mine. Paula Pluta saw it all from her front yard and ran to the place the plane crashed.
Little pieces of metal. There wasn't anything there but little pieces of metal. I unfortunately did not see bodies.
For the small crater, about 20 feet around and at least 10 or 20 feet deep, the bulk of the remains of that plane and all the 45 people who are on board may be buried deep in that crater just in the field beyond these trees here.
Have you picked up anything else on the ground tonight?
So again, we don't want to speculate, we don't want to jump to conclusions, but what we do know is that there is a site about a half mile behind me where the plane went down, where most of the debris is, and then about 6 miles away up by a lake, there is another area that's been cordoned off, and state police and the FBI have said definitely there is debris from the plane located there. We have a crew on the way right now. We should have pictures of that a little bit later on.
And as I said, there is a huge crater crashed in an open field. All that you really see there is a huge crater. You can't even see it very well from our vantage point. A huge black gaping hole, as investigators are describing it. There is a lot of debris, most of it very small.
No piece of wreckage was larger than a telephone book. No identifiable bodies were found.
Alert also went out to Somerset County Coroner Wallace Miller.
You have to understand that we're going through this area inch by inch.
He hurried to the scene, an abandoned strip mine. When he arrived, he couldn't believe his eyes.
It looked like someone had gouged about a 10-foot wide, 10-foot deep trough through the strip mine area. But when you looked in, it was just covered with dirt. There was nothing there that you could really say it was an airplane. There were just smoking things, pieces of aircraft, just small pieces everywhere.
That's really all you see is a large crater in the ground and just tiny, tiny bits of debris. There has been at least one report that the investigators out there, and there are hundreds of them, as I said tonight, have found nothing larger than a phone book.
We spoke to one eyewitness a short time ago, said she saw lots of debris, but nothing very big. And in fact, that's what our pictures are bearing out, that the debris is very, very small.
I've seen the pictures. It looks like there's nothing there except for a hole in the ground.
Basically, that's right. The only thing you could see from where we were was a big gouge in the earth and some broken trees. Nothing that you could distinguish that a plane had crashed there.
Smoke, fire?
Nothing. It was absolutely quiet. It was actually very quiet. Nothing going on down there, no smoke, no fire. Just a couple of people walking around. They look like part of the NTSB crew walking around looking at the pieces.
We're not buying it.
Okay, you don't have to buy anything. You're American. You want to be a nut, you can be a nut.
Anybody who thinks that 9/11 was carried out by the government isn't a truther. They're idiots.
I'm merely saying it is wrong, blasphemous, and sinful for you to suggest, imply, or help other people come to the conclusion that the U.S. government killed 3,000 of its own citizens, because it didn't.
How big a lunatic do you have to be to watch two giant airliners packed with jet fuel slam into buildings on live TV, igniting a massive inferno that burned for 2 hours, and then think, well, if you believe that was the cause?
You know what? It wasn't an inside job. We can see the planes. The planes hit the building. It wasn't a controlled demolition, and the buildings came down. And it just is beyond bizarre.
Yeah, and you are a nutcase, Building 7.
9/11 was an inside job. Oh, get a life. Get a life. 9/11 was an inside job. You're like the guys who think that the space aliens kidnapped Elvis or something like that. That's where you are.